All right, so the time being 5:15 p.m. on Tuesday, February 7th, 2023, we'll go ahead and kick off the Economic Development Committee meeting. We have a quorum of members present, so why don't we go on to item number 1, approval of minutes from 12/6 of 2022. Do I have a motion? Alder Killian moves to approve, I guess. Okay, all right.
Correct.
Is there a second to that? Okay, Alder Hanke. Any discussion or additions before we vote? All right, so all those in favor say aye for approval of the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. All right, minutes are approved. Let's move on to item number 2, update on Wausau World Market. Hey, Tammy.
Hello. I'm not quite sure what more you need to tell you than what's in the packet. It's not great news. We were hoping for a better turnout of rectifying Wausau World Market and working with the people that had purchased it on a land contract. Unfortunately, they were outbid at sheriff's sale. So that leaves us done, unfortunately. But we do like to look on the positive side because of the improvements of the property. I think you know in the last paragraph it talked about how this investment did do what it was supposed to as far as bring the property value up quite a bit. And if you take a look at how much we received in the taxes for the last several years, we pretty much recouped that $100,000. So you want to look on on the good side of it.
Any questions? All right, thank you for the update. All right, so item number 3, update on the First Amendment to Plaza Multifamily Phase 1 Development Agreement at 201 North 17th Avenue, AKA 1520 Elm Street. Director Burdick?
Sure. So we received a notice from the developer that on November 22nd, 2022, that they would not be able to meet the December 31st, 2022 completion deadline. And so we are working with them on an amendment to amend that completion deadline. We've been working since then on the amendment and collecting all the documents that are needed to satisfy the rest of the development agreement. I just wanted to make sure that the committee knows that this is intended to come to the March, we are hopeful the March Economic Development Committee meeting. Just wanted to put everyone on notice that while we know that the completion deadline was missed, we're still working through it. We're in a grace period. We're actively trying to rectify it. We just received the last communication we had from the Developers Council was yesterday. So we're in good communication and things are moving forward. I just wanted to keep everyone apprised.
Any questions about this?
Just one. So that is the building that Banter is marketing, right? That's behind the Plaza Hotel?
That's correct.
It's substantially up. There just looks like they're doing interior work. Is that?
I believe so. I did not check the latest on inspections and what they've permitted, but I know that the last time I talked to Bill Hebert about this, they were very, very close to done and had reached some percentage of occupancy.
Because the restaurant operator for the top piece has already come for the license.
Okay.
And the other night when we went past there was lights on in most of those units, like they were just doing they looked finished from what you could see from the outside, at least on that east half, so.
Great.
Okay. So
it's exciting.
So they'll have a new date for us then, roughly?
That's correct. It's because the condition precedent to every TIF payment includes the completion deadline, and so we want to make sure that they can get their TIF payment, so we need to make sure that the completion deadline is updated for that, for just the phase 1.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. On to our next update, an update on River Life Housing Developments.
Sure. So I put this on the agenda. We put this on the agenda because we wanted to make sure that the public was informed about what was going on at the riverfront. We've had a lot of questions over the last month or two with just some general confusion of what project is going on where. So we wanted to address it in a public forum, make sure that the public has an opportunity to be equally informed about this. So basically, there are two development sites that we've been working on. The one where Swiderski currently, we're working through a development agreement with them. That is where T-Wall had been located, and we terminated that planning option with them in March of '22. And then we took we moved forward on working with Swiderski later last year. I don't remember the dates exactly, but like I said, we're actively working through that development agreement. And that's just to the south of WOW to include 200 market rate apartments, approximately 800 and 2,200 square feet of retail in kind of both buildings respectively, with a bridge that kind of goes across. And they would also be including a parking ramp in that area for their tenants. And then, so that's one parcel that we've gotten some questions about. So that is actively moving forward, and we're in again, active communication with their council about the development agreement. And then the other parcel that I think is creating a little confusion is where the condos were going, which is just to the south of the Daylighted Creek and the River Life apartments as they stand right now. And that one, we, as everyone here recalls and the public may recall, we had a development agreement with a developer. We were on the third amendment there, and they had missed essentially a fourth deadline, and so we took it to this committee, I believe in. So it was November, to ask whether we wanted to work on a fourth amendment to basically just amend the dates. We decided not to move forward with that. So that one is no longer in the pipeline. We don't have any immediate plans to RFP that parcel. But that being said, of course, we can entertain, if anyone brings forward an idea or a proposal, we can look at it as this committee and then decide whether or not we wanted to move forward with that, or open it up, if there's enough interest that might be sparked to open it up for another RFP. But given a number of units in the pipeline right now, between 200 with Swiderski, the 154 that we are very excited about groundbreaking at the mall site, and then the 250-unit affordable housing developments that have their tax credit applications in, and we're waiting word on those. We just kind of wanted to put the brakes on an RFP for the immediate future and just kind of see where everything shakes out with that. So I think I hope that created more clarity than confusion.
So any questions about sort of the progress of that? Okay, awesome. Thank you for the update.
Yeah.
I just think there were a lot of projects coming through, and it's sort of nice just to have that clarity, just where we ended up landing. All right, so number 5 is discussion and possible action on amendment to standard deed restrictions to waive 12-month construction restriction with Wausau Coded Enterprises at 110 South 84th Avenue. Attorney Jacobson.
I apologize, there wasn't more in the packet. I see the deed restrictions did make it in there. And Steve Lepowski did indicate he would not be able to be here this evening, but looking at the standard set of deed restrictions that are in your packet, it would be in paragraph 1. You'll see that the deed was included where the city transferred the property on December 14th of last year, and I did not bring down my thread of emails, but he did indicate to me that he was concerned on behalf of his client about 1A, the restriction that says that the city has the option of repurchasing the land at the sales price if the grantee fails to start construction within 1 year of the date of the conveyance. And so they asked if there was any way to remove that restriction. I said we could take that to committee and council to see if they'd be willing to waive that restriction as to this conveyance for Wausau Coded.
All right, any questions? Alder Rasmussen?
No, but I will make a motion then that we accept the amendment. Our intention, I think, as a committee and a council was to support the conveyance, and we, at that time, didn't have a use for the land or want it back. So I'll make a motion that we approve the appropriate revision to remove that deed restriction.
Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
Okay, Alder Henke. Any other discussion or questions? Alder Killian.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Attorney Jacobson, what was the rationale for such an element of the agreement?
And I'm trying to remember, do you know anything, Randy? Or Liz, why? Because it was land they couldn't use, correct, Lisa? I'm thinking that it wasn't something they were planning to construct anything large on anyway.
Yeah, they're planning on using it for parking lot in the future, just as the location of where it's at for their future expansion. What we should have probably done is taken a look at those standard deed restrictions when they were going through the process and probably make something unique to what they're doing. This is unique in the sense that when we typically sell a parcel of land in the business campus, we're selling it for somebody to construct something that's going to have assessed value. This is really just a parcel that we didn't have any value in, minimal value for them as a parking lot, and that's just the reason for it, so.
Okay, makes sense, thank you.
But
Thanks, Randy.
Any other questions? Alder Hickey?
So they don't think they'll be able to start construction on the parking lot before next year on the 14th? Okay.
Apparently not.
Okay.
And I would recommend that you approve the motion made by Alder Rasmussen. I think they were just concerned, and, you can always say, well, we wouldn't come after you for that, but I have no authority to say that, and I don't know what a future council would do, and he was doing his job by asking that we remove that restriction.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none, let's go ahead and vote on the motion. So Alder Rasmussen, you moved to, can you
Yeah,
reiterate your
I
motion?
move that we would amend the standard deed restrictions to remove the 12-month requirement as recommended by the city attorney.
Okay, so all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. Okay, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then on to number 6. So discussion and possible action to direct staff to prepare amendment to the memorandum of right of first refusal between the City of Wausau and Jiminy Cricket LLC, eliminating restriction of the payment in lieu of real estate taxes for benefit of current owner Mocha Inc. at 309 McClellan Street. So, Director Burdick.
Sure. Just to introduce this topic, this is coming back from the December Economic Development Committee meeting. It was requested that it be brought back to ED in January for our 1-3 meeting, but we didn't have any, as everyone knows, we didn't have any timely items for that meeting. But I would also note that council on 11/15, there made a motion, there was a motion that, I'm sorry, a motion that failed, and a motion to refer to the resolution back to ED failed, but the minutes reflect wanting to see it further discussed in that committee to recommend the waiver of a pilot payment from the current owner. So Jiminy Cricket was the owner of the property at the time of the December meeting. They are a for-profit LLC. They transferred the property to Mocha, or sold the property to Mocha Inc., a nonprofit organization. With the deed was signed on December 30th and recorded on January 3rd, this year, 2023. The memorandum of right of first refusal, which, was dated August 31st of 2017, memorializes a deed restriction that the property owner must make a payment in lieu of taxes for 20 years, so through August 31, 2037, regardless of the property owner exemption status. So this committee today is not discussing the exemption status or that process, but what we need to decide is regarding the deed restriction. And basically, we need to decide whether to keep the deed restriction, which requires the owner or any buyer of the property to continue to make payment or payment in lieu of taxes for 20 years, whether we want to remove this deed restriction as it relates to the current owner, which is Mocha, or whether we want to amend the deed restriction to either a pilot payment or a lesser or a flat payment amount. Basically, do we want to do something different with that payment in lieu of taxes? So that's the general background of the issue and what we're here to discuss today. I do have copies. I realized that we didn't have things in the packet. I do have copies of the memorandum of right of first refusal that I will pass out to the committee members, and we will make this available in the packet going forward. I think we got 4 here, so got an extra.
So in looking at this, the part that's,
There's an extra, yeah. I figured it's all.
I'll take 2, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
so the part that we're discussing in this MOU or memorandum, right, is in which article? Is it Article 2?
It's basically,
Oh, it's in recital B?
it's in recitals, it's specifically called out in recital B, and then it's also referenced in recital C, in Article 2, and in Article 4, that it would run with the land and any successors and assigns. We do also, I'll note that we have our city assessor here if you have any questions, and we have, of course, our city attorney if you have any more specialized questions for them.
All right, Alder Rasmussen.
Thank you. You'll recall the last time we had talked about this in committee, we had David Hummer with us, who runs the Museum of Contemporary Art. He contacted me today, and he's had an emergency, so he wasn't able to join us tonight. So, but I think that based on his comments last time, I think it was fairly clear how the museum operates and, at what point he was at with trying to transfer the museum to his nonprofit entity. And I think that he went through the project and operated, in the confines of the project with some assumptions, right or wrong. But I also think that the use of the building matters. And so when that building was turned over to him by the city, that building from the outside looked okay. The inside was a wreck. And so it needed everything. And so he then borrowed the money, finished the project, opened the museum, has been hosting exhibits in it since. And, then I think wants to get that building to be tax exempt at some point, with the understanding that he knows that whether or not that building ever becomes tax exempt is subject to state law, it's subject to the opinion of the city assessor. We and the former community development director, none of us have the authority to tell somebody that they're tax exempt, nor can we forgive their taxes and all of this. And so baked into this transfer agreement, or this memorandum of understanding, was the caveat that this pilot payment would drop down if the building ever became tax exempt, which essentially nullifies the reason to make it tax exempt in the first place, because that then, even though he would transfer ownership on the building, still has the city's hand in his pocket for revenue. And I think that the use of the building matters. So when we look at other facilities in our community where community value and art appreciation and tourism and those components are making up the building's use, it makes sense that those type of buildings should at least endeavor to operate on a level playing field. And with this situation, it really isn't. We don't have other facilities or other similar facilities that have caveats like this in their contract, whereby, they are owing a payment in lieu of tax, which essentially feels like taxes. And so I do think, though, and I'd had some conversation after our meeting with the city attorney on this, and she said, really, the decision we have to make is, do we wish to remove the pilot payment for this owner, for any future owner, like now or in perpetuity? And it seems to me that it would behoove us to, assuming the ownership would ever transfer, take those decisions on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the building is becoming and what the use is. So for now, it's an art appreciation institution. It's a museum. It makes sense that we would look to get rid of the pilot payment for the current owner so long as the use continues to be such, recognizing that when the assessor makes those determinations, parts of a building can be tax exempt and parts can be taxed. So when Mr. Hummer was with us, he talked about developing the upstairs or the upper level into an event facility with the full understanding that that is a for-profit venture and that part of the building would be taxed. And he was completely agreeable to that. And much like the assessor can split square footage, they do it as an example like with hospitals. The clinics that exist within a hospital are taxed, the hospital portion where hospital operations are performed are not. And so that requires an on-site review by the assessor where they diagram out what portion gets taxed and what portion doesn't. And that really is what Mr. Hummer is seeking for this building. If the event space is taxable, so be it, tax it. If the museum isn't, then make it exempt. But with the pilot payment in place, that won't happen. And so if we would amend the contract to remove the pilot payment, we essentially level that playing field. But I do think that we need to reserve the rights for ourselves to not waive that requirement for future owners. Because let's say a future owner came into play and that building would revert back to being a restaurant. Well, obviously, that is a for-profit endeavor. And so I think that we would certainly not want to waive it off for future owners. I think we need to look at the situation we have for the ownership and the operation right now, address the agreement that we have now, but not waive that right for future owners. So I think the caveat should remain in the agreement that future owners, that needs to be a future decision for a future owner by a future committee and council. And I don't think we want to take that right away from them, but we should manage the situation we have currently on this particular contract. So that's kind of where we left off with this, but I think if we're going to make a revision, the way this is worded, that we would remove the pilot payment for Jiminy Cricket LLC in favor of MoCA, that really is enough. That's all we want to waive. So future owners, it's wide open for us to impose a pilot payment or taxes if the need arises, but we're looking to manage just what's happening for the museum portion of this building right now.
Okay, thanks. So was that,
I guess if you're looking for a motion, I would move that we amend the memorandum of first refusal to remove for this current owner and occupant all reference to a pilot payment.
okay, is there a second to the motion? Okay, Alder Lukens, let's discuss some more. Alder Killian?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yes, perhaps it would be of use for Mr. Rubo to provide some summary of the situation in terms of how separate an exemption is from the talk of the pilot. So I don't think this has anything to do, if I'm correct, with whether the property will be considered exempt or not exempt in the future. It's my understanding that that's completely separate. So maybe, Mr. Rubo, could you please confirm that is indeed something entirely separate than what we're discussing here today?
Sure, thanks. Yes, a property tax exemption in the state of Wisconsin falls underneath Chapter 70 of Wisconsin statutes. If the property use and the ownership meets those requirements within that statute, the property would be exempt. The pilot payment, I guess, happens when you run into those circumstances of an exempt organization owning a property becomes exempt, and now this pilot payment kicks in that is determined between the municipality and the property owner. So, they are two different things. Some exempt organizations don't have a pilot payment. Some exempt organizations do have a pilot payment.
Thank you, that's helpful. So on to, I guess, the topic at hand, which is not an exemption, something completely different, but the waiving of the pilot that was agreed upon in the agreement from 2017. So I presume some on this committee had perhaps supported or voted for that at the time. I'm not sure. But the party involved had agreed to it, and it was in writing. I think it had been portrayed when this came to council or the committee before that this was kind of a bait and switch type scenario of sorts. That's how it was characterized, but I find that difficult to grasp when it was in black and white in an agreement that apparently came before multiple bodies and was approved presumably by multiple bodies at different times. So it feels to me like the way that this had been characterized as kind of a surprise or a switch, that characterization I think seems to lack credibility in the facts as I understand them. And when we've talked about waiving pilot agreements or changing them in any way. There had been a case recently with the utility and a discussion of pilot, and that was a very different situation. I think it was talking about the interplay between some public entities in very extraordinary circumstances, dramatic rate increases that could be impacted positively by looking at the reduction of the pilot payment. Certainly not a circumstance like this, so kind of apples and oranges there. And I think part of my concern would be consistency and yeah, please correct me if I'm mistaken, because I may be. I was not on the committee or the council at the time, but my understanding of why this was even part of the agreement is that there had been public involvement, loan or what have you, e.g. public funds of some sort, and therefore, when you open the door to government support financially, then you open the door to government requirements in agreements. So if I'm not mistaken, the reason the pilot was in there, I'm guessing, is because and I'm taking a leap here, I was not on the body then, but that for public involvement, perhaps the city wanted to see or anticipated tax revenue, and therefore that stipulation was in there. That would be my guess. So if all of those things are correct, I really wouldn't see a reason that we would now change that agreement. I guess I would be at a loss for the rationale of doing so and how that would be consistent with expectations we've put on other agreements when there's public involvement. So, I enjoyed listening to the earlier argument to waive this, but I see no objective reason to do so, and I will not be supporting it. Thank you.
I guess I have one question. So we're talking about pilot payments, but that would only be something between the city and that entity, right? The other payers of the tax wouldn't get any payout, right? The other taxing entities.
I would ask, I don't know that off the top of my head. Rick, could you shed some light on that? I think that they can be arranged different ways, but yeah, there's always a gray area, it seems.
Yes, there's pilot payments. There's a wide variety of different methods and agreements that taxpayers get involved with the municipality. Of the ones that I do know of, and Mary Ann could speak better to this than myself here, but some of them are determined by the assessed value that the assessor comes up with. I do that for like the city of Schofield. I come up with a value, and then the municipality uses just the municipal tax rate and applies that as a pilot payment. So typically, it's just the municipal tax rate that is being used, but there's others that could use the full tax rate of that municipality.
Thank you. Alder Rasmussen.
Thank you. So the Finance Committee is actually going to hear Tuesday night a presentation on pilot payments and their function. So we'll be learning a little more about that. But essentially, the pilot payment, it does walk hand in hand with tax exemption. I mean, obviously, the financial intent of a pilot payment is to take the place of lost taxes. And so when you transfer a property to an entity that is not required to pay tax based on its legal status as a nonprofit, the only way that you can generate revenue from that property then to replace what would have been property tax is to impose a pilot payment, which is a contractual agreement. And so that's the only part of this that we actually have control over because it's a contract that's agreed to by the parties. It's not a waiver of taxes, and it's not that we're telling someone they're tax exempt or whatever. We have the ability to amend our contract to remove that obligation, which then speaks to the spirit of what the owner is trying to achieve. Obviously, they're operating a art appreciation facility that's, set to be a hub for the arts. It is not a for-profit venture. And, if part of it becomes such, that's for them and the assessor to figure out. But, we don't have, when we look at other museums, theaters, galleries, things like in this area, they are not operating with those payments. And, we have been asked to, and there's other agreements where we have baked pilot payments in other than just the water utility. I think at one point when they redeveloped the federal building for apartments, that had one. And there was some different caveats that have been built into contracts, but it's all about what we agree with the owner on. It's not to say that if we made an agreement with the owner on the front end, that we were going to give them this building that was, halfway to the wrecking ball. I think that the spirit of the intention of these agreements was that the project would be followed through on and completed. Because at that point, when this project came forward, the city had been sitting on the defunct and out-of-business Wausau Club for a number of years. They were heating the building, they were insuring the building, and nothing was happening there. They had one proposal on the table that never got off the ground, and so here they sat with this building, and it was a matter of how long do you continue to have this building in the middle of the downtown, which has some historical significance, like do nothing. And it was about something happening in the building. It wasn't about necessarily the revenue stream, but to make sure that a project got carried through to fruition and like opened and ran. I think these caveats got built in. It is what it is. I mean, we can decide as a committee and as a council subsequently, when asked by the owner, if we don't want the pilot payment anymore, we obviously have the authority to waive it. So hence my motion. I mean, if we think that we would like to reduce that payment to some other arbitrary amount, you also have that option. Or if you wanted to wait until our next meeting when David Hummer can be here, you have that option as well. So not to say a final decision has to get made tonight, but I think it's worth discussing because now the project is done, the place is open, we can see what it's generating. I mean, it is bringing in room nights, yet he has never asked for room tax. Where the other entities that are similarly situated, every one of them is lined up every year for room tax. So, I mean, that's something to consider also. He is buoying up a tide of art appreciation in the community, and yet he's not receiving the other sources of financial support that others have asked for and received. So, it's not a matter of making anyone wealthy. It's a matter of removing an obligation that really is draining from the bottom line of a facility that exists to appreciate art. So I think that's the spirit of where we were going last month. So.
And I guess my question too is so there's no revenue being generated by the where the exhibitions are, that the museum portion?
I don't know. I don't have his financials. That's what he will have to work out with the assessor at some point. But, whether I don't know. As far if he charges exhibitors to display, that I don't know. That's why he should probably be here.
And that's, I also wonder if it's a cart before the horse kind of thing, because, I mean, is it something that we would enforce and I mean, I understand the idea of what Ann was saying earlier about.
Well, if the nonprofit
it's
owns it
fair.
now, the pilot payment is coming, and that's why this is now timely. If he's done the transfer that we approved back in November, like when it came to council and we tried to massage it on the council floor and it was too complex for that to work, that ask was for him to be able to transfer that to a nonprofit entity. If he's closed on that sale and that's happened, that means the pilot payment is coming regardless. So we have to decide, do we want it or not, regardless of whether he ever applies to be tax exempt. Because Mocha Inc. is a nonprofit. So by nature, non-taxable, correct? No. I thought that's what we heard at council last time.
No, I don't want you to get confused between tax exempt organizations and entities that are given tax exempt status by the IRS with property that's exempt from taxation. Because you can have an exempt organization like a 501c3 that pays taxes.
Okay.
And you can have exempt entities that don't pay taxes, but it all depends on their use of the building and other statutory requirements as well. So the fact that he transferred it into an exempt entity, that maybe gets him other tax benefits, but it's going to have no bearing on whether or not he pays taxes.
Okay, so then he has to apply for exempt status through the,
Exempt status for the property, not for his organization. So we're
Right.
not looking to make the property owner exempt. We're looking at whether the use of the property applies or is eligible for a tax exemption.
right, so that is a totally separate process that he has to begin with the assessor on a timed schedule
Right.
this spring, right?
It's totally separate from his having gotten tax exempt status or transferred the property to a 501c3 organization.
Right.
Yeah.
And so following that review, if a portion of that building
Right.
becomes tax exempt
Yep.
based on his review with Rick,
Yep.
at that point, the only revenue source is the pilot payment. Right.
Yes.
And that's where the crossover
Yes.
comes. Because if,
Well, if any part of it becomes taxable, you're going to pay taxes. As you pointed out, you can't waive that. If a
Right.
portion of it, depending on its use and other factors, is determined to be exempt from taxation, then the pilot in this restriction would kick in.
Right,
If
and-
it's waived, then he wouldn't pay a pilot payment on that portion, but he's going to pay a
Tax
tax
on
on
whatever's
the other
taxed.
portion. So when you say portion, yes, if
Yes.
it's all exempt,
so that
then-
was the goal. So
Right.
assuming that the museum portion on the main level, through the assessor's review, becomes an exempt area of the building, the pilot payment is the replacement for the revenue, essentially. And so that's where we were trying to go to level this out. If the pilot payment is removed from the contract and the owner is successful in obtaining exempt status from the assessor, that eliminates that revenue source or that payment. Not whatever happens with the event space upstairs, if it's taxable, it's taxable. I mean, we don't
Right.
control that.
Right.
But if we leave the pilot payment in place, the museum gains nothing by exempt status, and that's the whole point. I mean, everything they've been trying to do becomes moot if the pilot payment stays in. And
Well-
that's what the discussion that we were having with Hummer when he was here.
And I wonder though, like, if we would remove it at a later date, if something else happened, something else changed, we could still remove it and help with this current year's taxes, right?
Correct.
Yeah, that, I don't think there's a deadline on this part, right? This, I mean, we could hold action on this
Correct.
to see the outcome of what happens. I mean,
Correct.
assuming he files for exempt status, we could actually hold this item until we know the result of that. Or, you know, we can hold it to a later date when we have him here. I mean, right now, it's a little difficult to have the discussion about what people pay him for and what they don't, because he's the owner. None of us work there.
Well, and as to the comments that have been made, we do have 4 or 5 current pilot agreements with the city, which I don't know,
Right.
maybe you'll hear about at finance, and we were going to review those because they're not all consistent with one another, and we never got back around to that. So they have varying provisions in them, but they generally are imposed, not generally for replacement for taxes, but for, in exchange for city services or benefits or TIF funds, or in this case, it was for this construction loan that they got, which was paid off in full at the time of the transfer of the property at the end of the year. But to Alder Rasmussen's other point, which I thought was a great one, it would be my recommendation that if you do agree to waive it in whole or in part, that you do it for the current owner for so long as the property is used for a particular use. Because any owner, this owner, I'm not saying David Hummer would do this, but otherwise he could turn it into a bar, or he could turn it into a parking lot. He could do whatever he wanted to it. And so it would be my recommendation that if you decide to direct me to amend the memorandum to eliminate that requirement as to this owner, that it be for a period of time that it's owned by this owner then.
For the purpose of
And
use as
for
a museum
whatever
or
use
whatever.
you
Yeah.
folks decide you want to put in there, however broad you want it or
Sure.
narrow you want it or whatever you want to put in there, whatever would be acceptable to you. But you've agendized this as action to direct staff to prepare an amendment, and her motion was to amend the right of first refusal. So I mean, I have it ready. I don't know what you want to do. If you want to bring it back to another meeting or vote on this motion to direct staff to amend the memorandum, and if that passes, bring it back to another meeting at which Mr. Hummer would be available, or what you want to do, Madam Chair.
Well, and I guess if the committee's spirit is that it wants to wait for the outcome of tax exempt review, I would withdraw my motion and we could hold this item until we know more, I guess, if we're interested in knowing the outcome of Rick's review.
Well, do we know when the review will be, Rick?
He hasn't made an application yet,
Oh, so
so
it's got.
Isn't there a cutoff, though, in April or something that's coming?
there are deadlines, yes, that can be found on probably the Department of Revenue website and the Property Assessment Manual. There's citizen resources there.
Would the seconder also agree to holding the motion? Or would?
Was that
or does-
Carol?
Yeah, I think Carol. Okay, Alder Lukens.
Thank you. I agree. I was thinking the same thing as you were talking before about, I would want it, if it would be decided ultimately at some point to, terminate the pilot payment requirement, I would want that, very much want that limited just to the.
This owner
Yeah, this
for a
owner.
certain use.
But I'm also curious about, you mentioned Alder Rasmussen mentioned other art facilities. So, and one other question before actually I ask that. Attorney Jacobson, you said that, an exempt entity, that status, that will have no bearing on whether he pays taxes. Are you talking, just so for anyone who may be watching this, to are real estate taxes? Is that what you are
Correct.
referring?
Right. Just because you become a tax exempt entity doesn't mean you're exempt from paying real estate tax.
Taxes. Okay, thank you. So that's my question, I guess, about, are the other arts entities, are they all nonprofit? I should probably know this, but, and do they, are they?
I think that's the question, like, are we taxing the Grand, the CVA, the PAF, and the Woodson facilities? I think those are the ones that are most comparable.
And that I don't know.
So I would definitely withdraw my second on the motion. I would prefer to hold this until we can find out more information and maybe find out about.
We can
if he
bring
moves
whatever
ahead.
information you need. Yep.
Thank you.
But the decision could be made, just so it's clear, independent of whether or not he makes an application. You could still move to bring this back and remove the pilot as to him whether or not he makes an application. So there's no time deadline on this action, just so you know that. It is separate and independent of whether he applies or whether he's found exempt.
Well, and I do
The
think that,
property's found exempt, not him as the owner, but the property is found exempt from taxation.
I do think that if the result of the application, if he submits one, is that the property remains taxable, then this entire issue is moot. I mean, taxes are
Correct.
taxes. So,
Correct.
Then at that point, the pilot payment's irrelevant. So I think it makes sense for us to know a little more.
Yep.
And I think Alder Killian, do you have?
I do, thank you. Well, Attorney Jacobson is there, so I've heard about the spirit of the agreement, but the spirit in the letter of the agreement was essentially that the city did receive ultimately revenue in lieu of taxes. Is that correct for the duration of whatever kind of public involved loan period there was?
I don't know what you mean by revenue in lieu of taxes.
The pilot, there was, and it was anticipated when this agreement was put together initially that there would be some form of payment. Isn't that at the center of the nature of what's trying to be
believe
waived?
So from
Right.
the agreement.
So that
Well,
was the
because of the
spirit
construction
and the
loan
letter.
agreement, and that's typically why you would impose a pilot payment, is when they ask for city participation. And so they got a construction loan agreement. I don't know if Tammy could probably talk about whether that happens with all of your business loans, but typically they'll impose that as a provision in an agreement when a loan is given, city participation. But I wanted to make sure that factually everybody knew that he did pay the loan back in full when he transferred the property at the end of the year.
Okay. The spirit and letter of the agreement was payment. That's what we're trying to waive here tonight?
Well, tonight you're just discussing whether to direct me to amend the agreement in any way, but particularly as to waive any pilot payment if and when the current owner, I'm assuming that's the way this is going, has any portion or all of his property determined exempt. That's what you're discussing tonight.
And when the agreement had been put in place a few years ago, to your knowledge, no one agreed to it under duress. There was no invisible ink or any funny business like that. Is that correct?
You know, I was here, I don't recall this. Tammy would remember more of the details. I didn't draft the agreement either.
Sure.
I have no individual memory of it. That's way beyond my retention.
And that's
at this
because I
point.
closed the loan, you
Yeah,
didn't.
there you go.
So to answer your question, we had Mr. and Mrs. Helmer came to my office and we reviewed the documents, and this memorandum was a topic that we discussed, because when I just talked about the, that they will be paying taxes for the next 20 years, we want to make sure, because of public participation, we wanted to make sure that it's a taxable, we're getting our monies back. You know, we're putting money into a property that we will reap the benefits, if you want to say. He did bring up, well, what happens if we turn it into a nonprofit and there are no real estate taxes? And I said, well, according to this agreement, we would ask for you to at least do a pilot payment, something, because we are requesting something back. So he did understand it. And then when he came back years later and Art was arguing the fact, we discussed it again, and I said, David, you do remember when we sat down? So he did remember. He didn't, I don't think he wanted to admit it, but he did remember.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's helpful there. And my other question would be, and could we please quantify what we'd be waiving? So it may not be really defined right now, but I think our body and any other body and the Common Council would want to know exactly what dollar sum we're talking about. And I think over a long period of time that could be substantial. So I think we'll want to know that. And also, I think whenever this comes back, it would be nice to see the minutes from each body it went to in the past, what the vote was, so we can see not only that the party consented to this, but that the members of the bodies, whoever voted to approve this, also consented to it. So barring there wasn't any funny business, and it sounds like there was not, then we have an agreement, and why even continue to have agreements from this committee anymore if we're going to waive or not defend any of them? So if a consulting firm doesn't meet the number of jobs they're supposed to for subsidies, no problem. Hey, if a loan doesn't work out like we just saw, no problem. If we have an agreement and you'd rather not pay taxes, no problem. I mean, so that doesn't sound like economic development. That sounds like economic implosion. If we have an agreement, we should defend it. And you know, our citizens, if their grass is too long or they have a weed that's 10 inches tall, they can get a fine in the mail and they have to pay that. They can't come here and we don't waive it for them. And this is much more substantial than that, at least in tens of thousands, at least over the period of what we're talking about. So let's be fair, let's be objective, and let's not take irregular steps in waiving valid agreements that were consented upon when we feel like it. It must be consistent, and in Wausau, Wisconsin, we should be putting out there a deal's a deal, and we'll stand behind our part, and we expect the other parties to as well. Thank you.
And the answer to your first question, because I can't answer the other ones, I think has been discussed at this committee. I mean, the first time this came up, I think we discussed what they had paid in taxes. They brought those current, but understand that's a partial assessment. So if and when they improve the property, make changes to it, renovate the second floor or whatever, I mean, again, that's an independent assessment from year to year that could change. If the use changes, the assessment could change. If portions of the property are exempt from taxation, then that's going to affect the overlying tax bill as well. So it's a little hard to even speculate or anticipate how much you're going to be giving up over 20 years if this owner remains the owner of the property, just because the use and the improvement of the property could change with time. So it's hard to answer that question, honestly.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobson. It sounds informally like the amount may be a heck of a lot, whatever it is, but thank you.
So I think information you wanted to sort of have collected when we have this discussion again was just records of past minutes to show us sort of where this has gone.
Yes, Madam Chair, and I'd like to see the votes on that as well.
So all the way, so it's been sort of weaving through back from 2017, right? So we'll, and then,
Well, so for clarification, though, prior to this ownership transfer up to this point, he has been paying property tax, not pilot payments. The pilot payment is a new thing with the transfer of the
Correct.
ownership, right?
Correct. He has been making, and.
It was
Rick, do you
property
know?
tax, not pilot.
Correct, it was property taxed, and he did
Right.
pay those in full. And Rick, do you know the approximate amount? Was it 9,000 a year or 17,000? One of those two amounts.
So the spirit of his ask, I mean,
remember,
as far
Candy?
as, like, when we talk about like arbitrarily changing contracts, the spirit of his ask came with the ownership transfer of the property and a change in his status. And so it's not that we just picked up the agreement and said, well, as a new council, we think it would be fun to just tear up the old agreement and start over. The ownership was changing. He was going through some interpretations between himself and our staff. And at that point, it came to this committee where he was asking that we reconsider the terms of that agreement, which we have the right to do. We also have the right to say no, but I think we need to know a little more. So it's not that we just did this for fun. Something was happening in his transfer of the property that we've decided to take a second look. So, but that said, the loan's been repaid and the project is essentially done. What he does from this point is up to him.
Right.
But
So Alder Rasmussen, any other information you'd like for our future meetings when we
no,
discuss
I think
this?
we're good on that. I think a projection of what the pilot payment would amount to, though, using a present value, would be helpful. I mean, we obviously can't forecast what the assessable value of the upstairs would be. It's not developed today, so we can only go on what we've got right now and what he's paid historically. But I think that would be relevant information. I think we should also request that when we have the conversation, that he be here. I mean, we may have questions. I have questions for him right now about what he makes money from and what he doesn't. And he's not here to answer that, so I don't think tonight that we're equipped to make a decision anyway.
Yep. Okay, so you withdrew your motion, you withdrew your second. Alder Killian, you voiced some opinions on what kind of material you'd like to make your decision. Yeah. Alder
Thank you,
Killian.
Madam Chair. Yes, and my understanding was quite recently that property was sold, and I know it had been listed for nearly $1 million. So whatever was paid in the past, I'm not sure how recent that data is, but we'll really want to take, I think, an objective look at, based on recent, however it's done from Mr. Rubo's office or what have you. I mean, in this case, the past may not necessarily represent the present or the future in the best way, given for the amount that was sold for, in my understanding.
Thank you. And then Alder Lukens, you mentioned more information you would like. I didn't know if you had any things to collect to have a better discussion on this in the future. Nothing?
Excuse me, I'd just like to know the status, on paying real estate taxes and of the other, there are a number of them. As I think what Alder Rasmussen mentioned them, probably the Grand,
I was going to ask for clarification
Yeah,
on that,
which-
Lisa, if you could
Well,
mention those again.
when we were
CVA,
talking about, when
PAF.
we were looking at the room tax recipients and the other art appreciation institutions, we were looking at the Woodson properties, the Leoki, the Woodson History Center, the Historical Museum, the Grand Theater, the CVA, and the PAF building. Those are the ones that we were looking at as comparables as far as what enhances the art community in this area. And a number of those are continuing appropriation entities for room tax. So
Got it.
that's where those comparables came from.
Would you also then like a proposed amendment? Would you want my office to prepare that and furnish it for your next meeting along with all this other information?
So maybe it wouldn't need to be for the next meeting. We could wait.
In draft form, though, it would make sense to have something ready. Would it not?
Potentially, or having maybe a joint, because if we do end up passing this, it's going to be a finance issue. So would we want to bring it to finance
Well, it's a development agreement amendment.
or have a joint meeting?
Yeah, we could put it as a joint item at an upcoming meeting. If there's no time urgency and we're still awaiting the application for exemption in the first place, we could essentially have three or 4 months to work this out, so.
So that's why, no urgency.
All right, just want to make sure I understand the expectation.
But then I guess drafting something at that point would be, just having some sample language.
Otherwise, what you've listed tonight, you'd want for next meeting, or?
I think in the future. like-
Okay, so no
May.
specific meeting, ED or finance yet, or a date certain?
I guess my understanding was that we would address this when the exemption status was determined. Is that correct?
Right. Is there a cutoff date for that we can establish? I mean, do we know from DOR, does that window run from like April to June or whatever? I mean, if we know when his last date to apply is, then we kind of know if we're going to have a future conversation or not. If he doesn't even apply, the whole thing is moot. So if there's a deadline, we wouldn't want to discuss it again until that's passed.
So I think maybe trying to place it for May might be a good idea.
All right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, we can get this
I
info
would just say
together.
that Mr. Hummer is well aware of when to apply for the property tax exemption. He has done it 3 times
Yep,
in the past.
yep.
Okay.
So maybe shoot for May on some of that material, and then we can maybe see about joint at that point too.
Yeah. If there's a
needed.
change to be made, yes. If we're
Yes.
going to stay the same, then it doesn't matter.
Right.
And Madam Chair, may I add one more for you in terms of comparables that we look at, if that's possible? Could we also see a list of agreements between such art entities as has been listed that we have waived agreements on?
If any exist, you mean?
Well, if it's an
Okay.
empty set, I'd certainly like to know that. That would be my guess, Attorney Jacobson, because this seems inconsistent. But if there is such a list, I'd like to see it. Thank
So your
you.
question is whether or not any of the other art entities who receive room tax have a pilot waiver of record? Is that your question?
Yes, I can
Okay.
even make it more casual. Did they enter into an agreement like this with a pilot involved that they then came back and asked us to waive?
All right, any additional
right,
questions or
thank you.
direction that we want to? All right, so I don't think we need to take action on that. We'll wait for a couple months. So now on to number 7, update on dates for April 4-6, July 7-5, and November 11-8 ED committee meetings for 2023.
Okay, so Shannon was looking ahead very dutifully and figured out that we have some conflicts coming up with upcoming meetings, several upcoming meetings. I believe they're all election related. Oh, and one's July 4th, thank you. So we are planning on, I think we put these out to the committee and didn't get any pushback, but if there is, if we do need to do any date changes, please let us know and we'll, do the proper notifications. But our meeting dates for the following months are updated as such. April is going to be on April 6th, July is going to be on July 5th, and November is going to be on November 8th. So those 3 meetings, April, July, and November, are updated from our normal, what are we at, the first Tuesday meeting schedule.
So those would be Wednesdays then?
I think that,
April 1's a Thursday.
Oh, okay.
yeah, we worked with as
and
many.
July is Monday.
And I have a conflict with 4-6, but if you can get quorum without me, that's fine.
July 5th is Wednesday, and then
November.
Sorry, I was looking in June, sorry.
So 1 Thursday and 2 Wednesdays. Okay. Any other questions or conflicts that people see for that? Okay. We are on to item number 8, adjournment. Can I have a motion? Alder Hinkie, second. Alder Killian, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Thank you.
Thanks.